I'm Dr. Erika Sigurdson, and welcome back to the channel, Making History. I've come across a lot of histories of dieting that place the origins of modern diet culture in the mid to late 19th century. And that's fair. And it's interesting and important to trace the history of something that plays such a massive role in our modern lives. I've also been interested in hearing from people talking about the relationship between, say, diet culture and evangelical Christian purity culture. So that extreme focus on abstinence and sexual purity within those communities. I might want to also throw in some other cultural phenomena that feel similar in some way. Things like clean eating, zero waste, CrossFit. There's a common thread in there, I think. And to trace the common threads of these different movements, I want to go a little further back than the 19th century. I want to talk about asceticism. Christian asceticism specifically, because there are other ascetic traditions, especially in various Eastern religions. And so if you are someone who's more familiar with, say, Buddhist or other non-Christian asceticisms, I would love to hear your thoughts about how that relates to what we're going to be talking about today. Oh, and either way, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell for notifications if you like what we're doing here. So let's go. Very early in the history of Christianity, so like 2nd and 3rd century AD, there was a movement towards self-denial and self-discipline as a means of improving the self and getting closer to God. Remember, this was in the time of the Roman Empire. In some ways, Rome was at its height. It held enormous territories, wealth, it had conquered its enemies, and it was the leader of the known world. But it was also collapsing. But even though it lasted a good long while afterwards, it's fair to say that the 3rd century was a bad century for Rome. There were droughts, famine, climate change, plague, there were civil wars, growing rifts between different segments of society, foreign invasions, hyperinflation. Rome didn't collapse in the 3rd century, but it was close. And it was towards the end of that century that we start to see this movement towards asceticism. In Egypt especially, but also other parts of North Africa, Christian people, started leaving the cities and towns to go live alone in the desert. They were leaving society to get away from the sins of the body, things like lust and greed, and also the sins of strong emotions, anger, jealousy. And they wanted to get away from decadence. They were worried about these social sins, overeating, overconsumption, fancy imported luxury goods. They didn't want to change society. They just wanted to get away from it. So what did asceticism mean for these monks? We can start by saying, fairly straightforwardly, that it meant physical self-denial, denying oneself like bodily pleasures, sex, good food, alcohol, that sort of thing. They often limited their food intake, sometimes very strictly. They would limit their sleep and push their bodies into hard physical labor. Some would even restrict their water. Some would deny themselves baths, the bodily pleasure of being clean and smelling nice. They spent a lot of time worrying about how much food was too much food. Many of them idolized John the Baptist from the Bible, who wandered in the desert eating nothing but locusts and wild honey. St. Anthony, one of the most famous ascetics, ate only bread, salt, and water. No meat, no wine. And he would often fast for 2 to 4 days at a time. A 5th century writer described a feast for ascetics as being a pound of bread, about a loaf, a drop of oil, 5 roasted chickpeas, 3 olives, 2 prunes, and a dried fruit. Some desert monks would only eat raw food. Some would eat fish. Some only bread and vegetables. They limited their food largely to practice self-denial and to fight the sin of gluttony. But some specific food restrictions were also put in place to help the desert monks in their other great battle against the body, the battle against lust. Certain foods were understood at the time to encourage sexual urges. Meat was the big culprit here. The word carnal, carnality, connects meat with sin, especially sexual sin. Another thing that could lead to sexual urges was good hydration. This was part of the thinking for monks who believed in restricting their water intake, for instance. One detail that I really like is that the monks were allowed to eat chickpeas, but only dry roasted chickpeas. Wet chickpeas were too sexual. I want to talk through the extent of the self-denial that was expected here. It wasn't really the goal to simply restrict, whether with food or with sex. There was this other layer. I think we can see this most clearly with celibacy. The first, easiest step really, is to just not have sex. The next step is to control thoughts of sex, feelings of attraction, or feelings of longing, either for a specific person or just more generally for companionship. Finally, the third stage is to gain control over what we tend to think of as uncontrollable physical responses, things like, wet dreams or erections. I want to emphasize here that the goal of these early ascetics wasn't to discipline the body just for the fun of harming themselves. They were striving for a kind of knowledge and to be closer to God by overcoming the needs of their bodies. I think we can get an idea of what that kind of means from an anecdote. This is a disciple of one of the Desert Fathers, explaining how far the old man, the monk, had come in his spiritual discipline. So here it is. He took the fish, intentionally cooked some of it badly, and offered it to the old man, who ate it without saying anything. So he said to him, "Is it good, old man?" And he replied, "It is very good." Afterwards, he brought him a little that was very good, and said to him, "Old man, I have spoiled it." And he said to him, "Yes, you spoiled it a little." In this story, the monk doesn't even notice the taste of the fish. He has moved past the stage of simply controlling his food intake through sheer discipline. He's able to control, maybe not even control, but like move past the desire, the physiological instinct of wanting food that isn't spoiled. And that was the goal. That was the holiness of these Desert Fathers. That was asceticism. So these people are called the Desert Fathers and Mothers because of their clear idea that in order to live this life of discipline and self-denial, they had to leave society and go live alone in the desert. But they weren't allowed to live alone for long. Crowds of faithful, regular Christians would follow these holy men and women into the desert. Some would become like disciples, wanting to learn how to live like them, and others just wanted to see them and meet them and learn for themselves. Before we move on, I want us to understand an important sort of philosophical idea underpinning these ideas of bodily discipline and control. So I want to talk about Manichaeanism. Manichaeanism is the forgotten world religion, but from the 3rd to the 7th century AD, it was one of the biggest religions in the world. In the Western world, it was briefly the main rival to Christianity. Christians were terrified of it. In Persia, where it originated, it was a dominant religion until something called Islam came along. There were Manichaeans everywhere, from Britain in the West all the way through to China in the East. So the one piece of Manichaeanism that I want to focus on today is the answer Mani was providing to a particular question that Christians were struggling with. A question that Christians still struggle with. If God is all good and all powerful, why is there evil in the world? For Mani, the answer is there's two gods. A good God, controlling the realm of spirit and goodness, and a bad God, a devil, controlling the evil realm of matter, physical stuff. So this is key. This is the important piece for our purposes here. The material world where we live is fundamentally evil and unbearably painful. I think everyone's felt that way at one point or another. But every human and animals and plants is made up of both. We have material bodies and we have a soul that comes from the realm of goodness and spirit. But our soul isn't like a bird trapped inside this cage of our bodies. It's more like we're a polycotton blend. Our good soul stuff is fully mixed in with, contaminated by our evil body stuff. So it's not a simple thing to just open the door of the cage. You have to figure out how to disentangle the cotton fiber from the polyester. Well, how do you do that? Asceticism. More specifically for Mani, it's moving towards knowledge. But to do that, to gain that knowledge, we have to master our bodies and our minds. Control our passions, control even our natural instincts, and guard our senses. That way we gain the knowledge that we need to cleanse the spirit part of ourselves out of the world. The knowledge that we need to tease out the cotton fibers and release them from the evil polyester. On a more practical level, this often looked a lot like the asceticism of the desert monks. Manichaeans also engaged in fasting, vigils, so not allowing the body to rest when it needs to, absolute celibacy. And one other piece, which was a little unique for Manichaeans, a refusal to participate in agriculture, especially harvesting. That one is because for the Manichaeans, even plants have a soul. They can feel pain, so you're murdering them when you harvest them. Now, obviously, it's not practical or possible for everyone in society to live like this, right? So the Manichaeans developed a religious system with two classes. The first were called the elect. They were a much smaller group of religious elites, we might say. And they were the ones who could actually do all that stuff. But the elect couldn't exist without the support of viewers like you. No. The regular, not super pure elect, were called the hearers, auditors. So called because their role was to listen, to hear the elect. They're the ones who go out and, murder all the fakes. They keep society going. They get married, they own property, they have children, all those necessary social things. It's easy to be cynical about this relationship, and lots of Christians were. It can look like the elect are just another parasitic class, The hearers feed them, keep them safe, do all the grunt work of keeping a society running. But we need to notice what the elect did for the regular people. Asceticism is hard. It's really, really hard. And if you know yourself, you might know you're not able to live that way. To live in the desert, surviving on 3 olives and a loaf of bread. Never have a family, never be loved. Most of us can't. But by supporting the elect, the hearers are exposed to their goodness, right? They can listen to their wisdom, hence the term hearers. And it might not be enough to help your soul escape all the way to God's world of pure goodness, but it will get you closer. And maybe after a few reincarnations as a hearer, you'll be good enough to become the elect yourself. This feels to me like a key aspect of asceticism. It's individual in a way, this pursuit of divinity through the individual renouncing of the demands of the body. but it's often a community effort as well. The desert monks in their way were doing the same thing, weren't they? They left society, but when the faithful followed them out into the desert, when people who wanted to benefit from their wisdom and their holiness went looking for them, the desert monks welcomed them, taught them. Well, I wanted to spend some time with the Manichaeans because of how influential they were on early Christianity, and indeed are on Christianity to this day. A lot of their ideas, especially this dichotomy of evil body, good soul, moved into Christian thought as well, and strongly influenced Christian ideas around asceticism. Why put so much energy into denying the wants, the needs of the body? It's because bodies are bad. The desert monks were living in the same environment and culture as the Manichaeans. They were all out there punishing their bodies together, but the clear connection, the straight line from the Manichaeans to modern day Christianity, goes through a 5th century Christian influencer called St. Augustine. Augustine actually was a Manichaean before converting to Christianity and writing several of its foundational texts. What Augustine rejected from Manichaeism was the idea of 2 gods, of a devil strong enough to fight God. Fair enough. You can't have a monotheistic religion with more than one god. But he kept the idea of the duality of a good spirit world and bad material world. Bodily urges, bodily needs, bad. Spirit, good. But no longer bad because of a powerful devil to rival God. Bad because of Eve, because of fallen human nature. Not all early ascetics were in Egypt, of course. Some other excellent early Hermetic traditions include Irish monks who like to go out into the ocean in these little one-person boats and just float around trying to find a desert island. The first people to live in Iceland are thought to be Irish monks who arrived that way. Another great example are the pillar ascetics of early Byzantium. These were ascetics who literally lived on top of pillars. This is pretty extreme. They were exposed to the weather, they often ate and drank very little, and generally would stand, not leaving their pillars or even sitting down for years on end. The most famous one from the early 5th century was someone called Simon Stylite the Elder. He lived on his pole for 37 years. There's a super gross story about Simon Stylite the Elder. The story is that when he was up on his post, he first got an ulcer on one of his feet, and he just didn't bother to do anything about it. A little while later, he got another infection on one of his thighs, and his response was to just stand on 1 foot instead of 2 feet. For 2 years, he was on 1 foot. And not only did he let the infection happen, he did this. Such huge numbers of worms fell from his thigh to the earth that those near him had no other job but to collect them and take them back from where they had fallen, while the saint kept saying, "Eat from what the Lord has given you." So he was asking people around him to pick up the worms that had fallen out of his thigh wound and put them back in so the worms could keep eating his flesh. But Simon was this huge draw for the public. People would come to see him on his pillar in these big crowds. And the general reaction to his gross worm infection wasn't disgust. It was awe at his endurance and his holiness. And there were emperors and powerful people coming to his pillar to consult with him. And they often took his advice. So something that I find odd about Simeon Stylites the Elder is that there doesn't seem to have been a discourse around whether or not his pillar lifestyle was taking asceticism too far. Because there were discussions going on throughout the 4th and 5th centuries about how much was too much mortification of the body. Were ascetics who, in their pursuit of a life free of excess, guilty of their own kind of excess? Like a prideful self-indulgence? A desert mother named Synclesia, writing in the early 4th century, said this about it. If these thoughts of extreme asceticism, come into the mind of a woman leading an anchorite's life, she must enter a community. And she must be forced to eat, even twice a day, if at least she is caught up in this illness through an excess of discipline. And she should be censured as vigorously as someone who is doing nothing important. So Synclesia is focused on female ascetics, but the same criticisms could be applied to men. It's almost as if asceticism is kind of a delicate paradox. Done right, the focus on denying, even harming the body, leads to a kind of transcendent wisdom of the soul. Done wrong, you've just fallen back into evil. You're focused on your body in a different but equally sinful way. By the early Middle Ages, this solitary monastic tradition had been replaced by regular communities of monks. But asceticism never went away. It became codified into the rules of these communities. Everything from rules about how much and what kind of food they could eat, to rules about the color and weight and number of their robes, and the whole staying celibate thing. And throughout the Middle Ages, there were other ways of practicing asceticism. Ones accessible even to people outside of traditional monasticism. So possibly the weirdest of them was the tradition of anchorites. Practiced throughout the Middle Ages, mostly in Britain, and especially by women, anchorites, or anchoresses, were individuals who voluntarily chose to be walled into buildings. So usually their cells were built onto churches or cathedrals. They were single rooms, anywhere between a few feet long to about 12 feet by 12 feet. They were walled in, Cask of Amontillado style. To be clear, they weren't left to die in the walls. They had servants to bring them food. They often had window access into the church so that they could participate in services and through which the priest could pass them communion. And they had a window to the outside for air. And like Simeon the Stylate, they weren't left alone to just rot in their cells. Anchorites were visited frequently by all kinds of lay people. Kings and regular people would come to visit and ask their opinion about all kinds of things. They were seen as uniquely holy and uniquely wise. But yeah, in pursuit of a higher spiritual life, these people would go into a voluntary, solitary confinement for the rest of their natural lives. Another fun variant on medieval asceticism was this later medieval phenomenon of these very religiously minded lay women who would start to eat less and less until they were surviving on nothing but the host, so the Eucharist bread. This whole phenomenon is described in detail in a book called Holy Feast, Holy Fast by Caroline Walker Bynum. She's quick to say that this isn't just a case of medieval anorexia. These women were working in quite a different cultural environment. But they were engaging in a similar extreme denial of the body to the early Desert Fathers, to the point of it being a miracle they were even alive. Now, both of these examples are extreme, and they were both practiced outside the regular sanctioned activities of the church. It's not a coincidence that both of them were dominated by women either, in a time with significantly fewer mainstream options for women to become part of the clergy or the monastic community. Extreme asceticism is often radical, countercultural. But all the while, the regular sanctioned asceticism of the monasteries and convents existed as this more socially sanctioned, controlled form of ascetic activity. And something interesting that I want to highlight is this practice that developed of asking monks or nuns to say masses for your soul. This meant that wealthy lay people who knew they weren't going to be able to do it could still benefit from monastic asceticism. If you liked what a monastery was doing, you could patronize them, give them money so they could continue doing it. Now, of course, there were lots of forms these donations could take, but what I'm talking about here is when wealthy lay people would, in their wills, leave a certain amount to a monastery in exchange for the monks performing masses for their soul. The idea being I know I'm not a good enough person to go to heaven on my own merits, but these people are super holy, so if they put in a good word for me, that'll count for much more. So again, we're seeing this reciprocal relationship, right, between different groups in society. But this practice looks a lot like paying for salvation, and it became the target of criticism from another big religious movement, the Reformation. So after the Protestant Reformation, the question of Christian asceticism does get a little bit more complicated. First, a lot of early Protestantism was very defined by rejecting anything that had to do with Catholics. So it gets kind of hard to know if they're opposing a practice on its own merits or just because it's a Catholic thing. Secondly, there's a lot of different kinds of Protestants. They often had very different, even contradictory ideas about, just about anything. So there's no question that early modern Protestants especially practiced what we might call austerity, hating dancing and revealing clothing, things like that. But calling it asceticism, a bit tricky. That being said, I wanted to highlight one classic idea from a scholar who did see something that he called a Protestant asceticism that I think says something interesting for this current discussion. So this is coming from the early 20th century sociologist Max Weber. He suggested a movement in Protestantism that he called worldly asceticism. So early Protestants rejected the Catholic ideas of monks and monasteries, of having a separate class of people who were extra holy, making it possible for them to retreat from the world and foster their special connection to the divine through extreme acts of self-discipline, things that we ordinary people just couldn't do. They would not have liked the Manichaean elect. So instead, Protestant asceticism, at least according to Weber, is individualistic. You can't just pay some monks to do it for you. But because of that, it's also worldly. We can't all live on pillars or brick ourselves into the walls of the local church. We regular people have jobs and families. So Protestant asceticism then is kind of everyday asceticism, one where you still have to go to work. You stay in society, you have a family, you just stay away from pleasure and excess. But then the question comes back, is this really asceticism? Is retreat from society a necessary feature? So like I said at the start of this video, I can see elements of this ancient asceticism in modern things. The diets, the detoxes, the clean living, even, the obsession a few years ago with decluttering and capsule wardrobes. What's new, I think, is that these are all secular asceticisms, arguably humanist asceticism. Someone doing a social media detox is unlikely to be doing it because they want to get closer to God. But they might be renouncing society, renouncing social media to get closer to something spiritual. Maybe you want to get back in touch with your true self, with your purpose. And then there's other aspects of Christian asceticism that I think kind of lurk in these modern activities. There's the focus on disciplining the body, which sometimes descends into punishing the body, which itself is still based, however distantly, in that Manichaean duality, right? The body is bad, material things are bad, sinful. We might not call the higher part of ourselves the soul anymore. We might call it our will or our prefrontal cortex, but there's still this tendency to see it as better, higher, less debased than our gross material bodies. But at the same time, I would say that we're still kind of stuck with that Protestant notion of an individualized asceticism, Weber's worldly asceticism. We don't have desert monks we can go visit and be impressed by and learn from and be in the community around. We don't have monasteries we can pay to do our asceticism for us. We've each got to do our own damn diets. And we've lost that early Christian awareness of how hard it can be. Asceticism is hard. And the idea that most people aren't called to it. Most people can't do it. I think there's other parallels that are kind of interesting. One scholar of the early desert monks describes asceticism as a transformation of the self through discipline and denial. And I think we can see that in these modern versions of it as well. Dieting or CrossFit or whatever is rarely just about the literal physical goal, right? Getting skinnier or musclier or whatever it is. That's part of it, but there often is this element, this promise of transformation. You're going to be a different self, your best self. I guess where I get a little confused is thinking about what that higher self is in a secular post-Christian context. Skinnier, I get that. With a tidier house, maybe? But spiritually, on that higher level, what are we supposed to be transforming ourselves into in this secular asceticism? I don't know. I just think it's interesting how it does seem to be that these things of the past so kind of almost transmogrify into new cultural movements or ideas in the present. How some aspects get dropped or get forgotten, but others stay really fixed. It's a layered topic. I don't have a simple, definitive answer to how and why this happens, but I'm sure you've all observed aspects of this modern version of asceticism in your own lives or in people around you. What do you think? Anyway, I really enjoyed talking through these ideas with you today. Give us a like if you want, and check us back out in another week when we'll be back with another new video. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.